The rain on the mining colony of Agate 4 did not wash things clean. It only made the grime slicker, turning the coal dust and red clay into a slurry that coated the prefabricated habitats in a permanent, rusty bruise. Inspector Davis stood in the doorway of Hab Unit 7, wiping water from his visor. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and sharp, terrifying panic. A woman sat at the small plastic steel table, her hands gripping a mug so tightly that her knuckles were white knobs under her skin. She was shaking, a subtle vibration that rattled the spoon on the table. Davis sighed. He had been on Agate 4 for 6 months, and he had seen enough misery to fill a tanker. But this was different. This was the third report in a week. The woman looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by a grief that had struck her only 4 hours ago. "My boy," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "He was just playing in the yard. The perimeter fence was locked. I checked it. I always check it." Davis pulled out his datapad, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. "Ma'am, we have checked the sensor logs. There was no breach in the perimeter, no air traffic, no seismic activity. Children wander off. The tunnels are dangerous. We have search drones in the ventilation shafts right now." He did not tell her that the drones had found nothing. He did not tell her that the thermal signatures had simply vanished, as if the boy had been erased from existence between one heartbeat and the next. "He was taken," the woman insisted, a sudden fire lighting behind her tears. "I saw lights, not ship lights. They were blue, silent. They came down like mist. And then he was gone." Davis pocketed the pad. "Local traffickers use masking fields sometimes," he said, reciting the script the colonial governor had emailed to all law enforcement personnel that morning. "We are looking into it." He turned to leave, unable to bear the weight of her stare. As he stepped back out into the relentless, acidic rain, he tapped his comms bead. "Central, this is Davis. Mark another one as a runaway. Possible accident in the lower mines." The response crackled in his ear, bored and distant. "Copy that. Davis, close the file. We cannot have panic affecting the ore quotas." Davis looked up at the gray, swirling sky. He knew it was a lie. He knew it in his gut. This was not a runaway. This was not a trafficking ring running low-grade labor to the asteroid belt. This was precision. This was technology far beyond the rusted junk haulers that serviced this sector. Something was taking the children of the outer colonies, and the people in charge were not just ignoring it. They were letting it happen. Light years away. The air was clean, scented with lavender and ozone, but the rot was just as deep. Princess Varela of the Thalzari Empire stood on the balcony of her private quarters, overlooking the capital city's gleaming spires. She was a striking figure, tall and corded with the dense muscle of her species, her skin a pale, iridescent violet that shimmered in the twilight. Her hair, a cascade of silver braids, was pulled back tight, revealing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. She was royalty, but at this moment, she felt more like a prisoner. The datapad in her hand was heavy, an ancient model she kept for encrypted channels that the Imperial Intelligence Network could not scrub. The message on the screen was simple, text only, sent via a burst transmission from a cargo hauler near the fringes of human space. "They took my daughter. The lights were blue. They smelled like ozone and antiseptic. Please. You are the only one who listened before." Varela's grip tightened on the device. The metal groaned under the pressure of her fingers. She had warned them. 2 years ago. She had stood before the High Council and railed against the unauthorized reopening of the Delta-9 biolabs. She had presented evidence that a rogue faction within the military was experimenting with rapid growth cloning. a technology strictly banned after the Orion crisis nearly wiped out 3 star systems. The Orion crisis. The words still tasted like ash in her mouth. It was a war fought not over territory, but over the definition of life. The Thalzari had created soldiers that could not die, could not feel, and eventually could not distinguish friend from foe. Her own sister had been a casualty of those early, arrogant experiments, her genetic code unraveled until she was nothing but screaming biological sludge. For her insolence, Varela had been stripped of her naval command. Her flagship, the Void's Edge, was docked in a dry dock she could not access. Her rank was ceremonial. She was the princess of the blood, yet she had less power than a mid-level bureaucrat. But she still had eyes. She swiped across the screen, bringing up a holographic map of the frontier sectors. Red dots appeared: Agate 4, New Jericho, Station 12. The disappearances were not random. They formed a perfect agonizing curve, a harvesting route that aligned with the patrol schedules of the 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet was commanded by Admiral Kazior, her cousin. Varela slammed the datapad down on the railing. The sound echoed across the silent balcony. It was not trafficking. It was harvesting. They were taking human children because human DNA was malleable, adaptable, and compatible with the banned Thalzari strengthening serums. They were using children as raw material to restart the super soldier program. The door chimes rang. Varela composed herself, smoothing the front of her ceremonial silk tunic. "Enter," she commanded. A protocol droid hovered in. "High Counselor Vallis requests your presence at the preliminary hearing, Your Highness. The session regarding colonial stability is about to begin." Varela turned, her eyes cold and hard. "Good. I have a few words to say about stability." The Galactic Senate Chamber was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering and moral bankruptcy. Thousands of floating pods arranged in a massive sphere held representatives from 100 worlds, all looking down at the central podium where the High Council sat. The air was cool, recirculated, and thick with the drone of polite debate. High Counselor Vallis, a Thalzari of immense girth and graying scales, raised a hand. The chamber fell silent. "We acknowledge the concerns regarding labor shortages in the outer human colonies," Vallis boomed, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "However, attributing these shifts to abduction is paranoia. The grim reality is that frontier life is harsh. Mortality rates are high." Varela's pod detached from the wall and floated downward, cutting through the designated airspace of the Trade Federation. A murmur went through the assembly. She was not on the docket. Paranoia? Varela's voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp edge of a command. Is it paranoia when the patterns match the exact supply route of the 7th Fleet? Is it paranoia when the missing demographic is exclusively children between the ages of 5 and 10, the prime age for genetic bonding? Vallis looked up, his expression one of bored irritation. "Princess Varela, you are out of order." "I am out of patience," Varela snapped. Her pod halted 10 meters from the council seats. She projected the map from her datapad into the center of the room. A giant hologram of the harvesting route materialized, glowing bloody red. "Look at it." She gestured to the star chart. "You claim these are runaways or accidents, but runaways do not vanish without a trace in a vacuum. Accidents do not leave behind resonant signatures of military-grade teleportation beams." Counselor Vallis leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "You tread on dangerous ground, Princess. You accuse the Imperial Navy of treason without proof. The proof is in the labs you are hiding in the Pellucid Nebula," Varela shouted, her diplomatic veneer cracking. I know Kazior is out there. I know you are funding him. You are building the abominations again. You are stealing the children of our allies to forge monsters." The chamber erupted. Shouts of denial and outrage clashed with gasps of horror. Valis slammed his fist onto a control panel. "Silence!" The audio dampeners kicked in, sucking the sound out of the air. Varela kept shouting, but her words were swallowed by the suppression field. She saw Valis say something to the security chief. Her pod was seized by a tractor beam, dragged backward with jarring force. A message flashed on her console, overriding her controls. Diplomatic privilege suspended. Confinement ordered. Location: Lunar Diplomatic Tower. She pounded on the glass of her pod, her eyes locking with Valis. He offered her a small, pitying smile. He thought he had won. He thought that by locking her away in the gilded cage of the moon, he could silence the storm. He had forgotten who her ancestors were. He had forgotten that before the Thalzari were politicians, they were hunters. The Badlands of Sector 7 were a graveyard of ships. The planet, a hunk of rock simply designated XR-99, had no atmosphere to speak of, just a thin haze of argon that tinted everything purple. Jace Reiner sat in the cockpit of his salvage skiff, the rust bucket, watching the thermal scope. He was 40 years old, but the war had put another 20 years on his face. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a plasma grenade on Mars. He wore a battered flight suit that had been patched more times than it had been washed, and his hands were stained with grease and gun oil. He was not looking for children. He was looking for a hyperdrive regulator from a crashed freighter. It was a mundane job for a man who had once led a recon squad through the fires of the siege of Europa. But mundane paid the bills. "Got a ping, boss." His ship's 6, a stuttering algorithm named Bucky, chirped. Jace leaned forward. "Is it the regulator?" "Negative. Biological signal faint. It is coming from that debris field in the northern canyon." Jace frowned. "Nothing lives down there. The radiation leaks from the old destroyers would cook a man in an hour." He should have turned the ship around. He should have grabbed the regulator and jumped to the nearest trade station to buy a bottle of whiskey and a warm meal. But the soldier in him, the part that he tried to drown in cheap liquor, twitched. "Bring us down," Jace muttered. "Keep the shields double front." The rust bucket descended, thrusters kicking up clouds of purple dust. The debris field was a twisted metal skeleton of a long-forgotten battle. Amidst the shattered hulls of frigates, Jace saw it, a small, spherical escape pod, wedged between 2 massive engine turbines. It was a modern pod, clean white lines, civilian markings. It did not belong here. Jace landed the skiff and cycled the airlock. He grabbed his rifle, a kinetic heavy hitter that fired solid slugs, distrusting energy weapons in a radiation zone. He stepped out onto the rocky surface, the magnetic boots of his suit clanking with every step. The silence of the vacuum was heavy. He approached the pod, checking the vitals on his HUD. 1 life sign. Weak. Heart rate elevated. He wiped the dust off the pod's viewport. Inside, curled into a ball under the emergency blanket, was a child. A girl. Maybe 7 years old. She was terrified, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. Jace popped the manual release on the hatch. The seal hissed, venting stale air. He reached in, his movement surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "Hey there, kid," he said, his voice roughened by the suit comms. "You are okay. I have got you." The girl flinched, pressing herself against the back of the pod. She was wearing a nightgown, stained with soot. "I am not going to hurt you," Jace said, lowering the rifle. "My name is Jace. I am getting you out of here." He reached out a hand. She looked at it, then at his face behind the visor. Slowly, trembling. She took his gloved hand. He pulled her out, checking her for injuries. She was dehydrated, likely suffering from mild radiation sickness, but alive. "Who are you running from, kid?" Jace asked, scanning the horizon. The girl grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She pulled him down so her helmet touched his chest plate, conducting the sound directly through the materials. She whispered one word, a word that carried a weight of desperation that froze Jace's blood. "Princess." Jace stiffened. He did not know what it meant, but he knew trouble when he heard it. And right then, his proximity alarm screamed. 2 sleek black drones crested the canyon ridge. They were not scavengers. They were military-grade hunter-killers, and their weapons were already glowing hot. "Hold on!" Jace roared. He scooped the child up with one arm, leveling his rifle with the other. He fired a 3-round burst. The slug slammed into the lead drone, shattering its sensor array. It spun out of control, crashing into the rock. The second drone returned fire. Plasma bolts scorched the ground around Jace's boots. He sprinted for his ship. The girl clutched to his chest, adrenaline flooding his system like a drug he had not tasted in years. He did not know who this girl was or why she was whispering about royalty. But Jace Reiner had never left a civilian behind in his life, and he was not about to start now. The lunar diplomatic tower was less a prison and more a tomb with a view. From her suite on the 50th floor, Varela could see the blue marble of Earth hanging in the void, beautiful and fragile. She had been pacing for 3 hours. The door was sealed with a molecular lock. Her comms were jammed. She was cut off from the galaxy, silenced while the harvest continued. She stopped by the window, staring at her reflection. She saw the fear in her own eyes, and she hated it. A soft chime sounded, not from the door, but from the service hatch near the floor. Varela turned, crouching low. The hatch groaned and slid open. An old Thalzari face peered out, skin wrinkled like dried parchment, eyes milky with age. It was Kaelin, her family's oldest retainer, a servant who had scrubbed the floors of the palace when her grandmother sat on the throne. "Princess," Kaelin wheezed, pulling himself up. "Kaelin," Varela whispered, helping him. "How did you get past the sentries?" "Old tunnels," he said, brushing dust from his gray tunic. "The Empire builds new walls, but they always forget the old foundations. I heard what happened in the Senate. The servants talk. We know what Valis is doing." Varela gripped his shoulders. "I need to get out. Kaelin, I need to get to the fleet." "No," Kaelin said, shaking his head. "The fleet is compromised. Kazior has loyalists on every ship. If you go to the stars, they will shoot you down as a traitor." "Then what do I do?" Varela asked, her voice rising. "Do I sit here while they liquidate children?" Kaelin reached into his tunic and pulled out a heavy iron key. It was ancient, unadorned, and cold. "You go back," he said, "before politics, before the treaties. You go to the old vault." Varela stared at the key. A chill went down her spine. The old vault was a myth, a bedtime story about the days when the Thalzari were not starfaring diplomats but apex predators who conquered worlds with blade and claw. "The hunters," she breathed. "Are they real?" "They sleep," Kaelin corrected, waiting for the blood of the line to wake them. "They do not serve the Senate. They do not serve the Navy. They serve the blood." He pressed the key into her hand. "There is a shuttle in the maintenance bay," Kaelin said. "It is garbage, but it will fly. The coordinates for the vault are in the nav computer. I put them there myself 20 years ago, just in case." Varela looked at the old man. "If I do this, if I wake them?" I can never go back. I will be a monster in the eyes of the council. Kalen smiled, a sad, toothy expression. Better a monster who saves the innocent than a hero who lets them die. Go, my child, burn the sky. Virella kissed his forehead. She took the key and dropped into the service tunnel. She did not look back. She crawled through the dark, smelling the grease and the damp, moving toward the destiny she had tried so hard to outrun. The shuttle was indeed garbage. It rattled and shook as it skimmed the surface of the moon, flying below the sensor grid. Virella fought the controls, her hands flying over the manual inputs. She landed in the dark sector of the moon, a place of jagged craters and eternal shadow. There was no landing pad, only a flat expanse of gray dust in front of a massive basalt cliff. Virella donned an environment suit and stepped out. The silence of the moon was absolute. She walked toward the cliff face. There was no door. But when she held up the iron key, the rock shivered. A seam appeared in the stone. Massive gears, untouched for 1,000 years, ground against each other, the vibrations traveling through the soles of her boots. The cliff opened, revealing a maw of darkness that swallowed the light of her suit's torch. She entered. The air inside was pressurized, thick with the smell of stale incense and cryo-fluid. The chamber was vast, a cathedral of black stone carved into the heart of the moon. Along the walls, towering 30 feet high, were statues of warriors. But as Virella walked closer, her torchlight flickering, she realized they were not statues. They were sarcophagi. They were encased in translucent amber resin, frozen in mid-snarl, mid-strike. They were the Thalzari of old, 7 feet tall, possessing 4 arms, their carapaces armored in natural biosteel. They were beautiful and terrifying, creatures evolved for one purpose, the hunt. In the center of the room stood a pedestal made of obsidian. On top of it rested a crystal the size of a human head, pulsing with a faint rhythmic crimson light, the summoning crystal. Virella approached the pedestal, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was forbidden magic. This was the bioscience of the deep ancestors, the kind that required a tithe of life force to activate. She removed her gauntlet. She drew a ceremonial dagger from her belt, the one she kept for courtly display, never thinking she would use it. She sliced her palm. The pain was sharp and grounding. Blood welled up, dark and rich. She placed her hand on the crystal. The reaction was instant. The red light flared, blindingly bright. A shockwave of energy threw her hair back, the sheer power of it nearly knocking her to her knees. She felt the crystal drinking from her, not just her blood, but her will, her rage, her fear. It tasted the betrayal of the Senate. It tasted the grief of the mother on Agate 4. It tasted the fire of her own helplessness. The chamber began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in her teeth. The amber prisons lining the walls began to crack. Virella looked up, her eyes glowing with the same crimson energy as the crystal. She felt the connection snap into place, a neural link to 100 minds that knew only war. She spoke, her voice amplified by the power of the room, echoing like the judgment of a god. Let the fiercest hunters awaken. The sound of shattering resin filled the chamber. First one, then another. Massive shapes dropped from their alcoves, landing in crouches that shook the floor. Dust and shards of amber flew through the air. The first hunter stood up. He was a giant, his armor scarred from wars fought before humanity had invented the wheel. He had 4 eyes, burning with a cold, predatory intelligence. He carried a glaive made of bone and energy. He looked at Virella. He smelled the blood on her hand. He sensed the royal genetic marker in her veins. Slowly, With a grace that belied his monstrous size, the hunter went down on one knee. He lowered his head. Behind him, a dozen more did the same. Then 100, an army of nightmares, bowing to their queen. Virella stood before them, her hand still bleeding, her chest heaving. She was no longer just a diplomat. She was no longer just a disgraced commander. She was the pack leader. "Find the children," she whispered into the silence, "and kill anyone who stands in your way." The lead hunter raised his head and let out a sound that was not a roar, but a low, chittering hiss of anticipation. The hunt had begun. The escape from the moon was a violent tear in the fabric of the local silence. Virella did not fly the stolen maintenance shuttle with care. She flew it like a weapon. The vessel screamed through the thin atmosphere, its hull groaning under the stress of maneuvers it was never designed to perform. Clinging to the exterior magnetic plates were the hunters. They did not need air. They did not fear the vacuum. They crouched against the metal skin of the ship, ancient statues brought to terrifying life, their eyes scanning the stars for threats. Inside the cockpit, Virella fought the yoke, her hands slick with sweat and the dried blood from the summoning ritual. The crystal's energy still hummed in her veins, a jagged electric current that sharpened her senses to a painful degree. She could feel the location of the child. It was not a psychic vision, but a pull, a tug on the ancestral instinct that the Thalzari had buried beneath centuries of diplomacy. The child had spoken her name. That created a bond, a thread of responsibility that vibrated across the empty dark of space. She punched in the coordinates. Sector 4, a lawless expanse of asteroid belts and smuggler way stations known as the Drift. That was where the tracker was heading. That was where the soldier Jace Reiner had taken the girl. Virella gritted her teeth. He probably thought he was a hero. He probably thought he was saving the child from the big bad empire. He had no idea that by taking her, he had lit a beacon for every bounty hunter and hit squad in the sector. She pushed the throttle forward. The shuttle engines flared blue, and they jumped into the slipstream, leaving the moon and its secrets behind. Jace Reiner was not feeling like a hero. He was feeling like a man who had kicked a hornet's nest and was now waiting for the sting. He had docked the rust bucket at a decommissioned refueling platform floating in the drift. The place was a rust-colored tomb, silent and cold, but it had atmosphere and gravity, which was what the kid needed. The girl, who had told him her name was Alara, sat on a crate in the cargo hold, wrapped in a thermal blanket. She was eating a nutrient bar with the ferocious appetite of someone who had been starved, but her eyes never stopped moving. She watched the shadows. She watched the vents. Jace cleaned his rifle at the workbench nearby. He kept the weapon disassembled, checking every spring and pin. It was a ritual that calmed him. "We need to keep moving, kid," Jace said, snapping the barrel back into place. "As soon as the drive cools down, we are gone. I have a contact in the Outer Rim. He can get you new papers, a new life." Ilara stopped eating. She looked at him, her expression wise beyond her years. "They will find me," she said softly. "The bad men. They have eyes everywhere." Jace slotted a magazine into the rifle. "Let them come. I have dealt with worse." He had not. He knew that. The drones that had attacked them on the planet were high-end, expensive. The kind of hardware that did not get deployed unless someone very powerful wanted something very badly. A heavy thud reverberated through the hull of the ship. Jace froze. It was the sound of a magnetic grapple locking onto the airlock. He had not picked up anything on the sensors. Whoever was out there had ghosted right past his perimeter alarms. "Stay here," Jace hissed. "Get behind the crates." Ilara scrambled into the shadows. Jace brought the rifle up. thumbing the safety off. He moved to the airlock door, positioning himself behind a heavy support strut. The airlock cycled. The hiss of equalization was loud in the quiet hold. The inner door slid open. Jace expected a squad of stormtroopers. He expected a flashbang grenade. Instead, a woman walked in. She was tall, violet-skinned, and dressed in a torn diplomatic tunic that was stained with grease and blood. Her silver hair was a wild halo around her face. She looked like a queen who had just crawled out of a grave. Jace did not hesitate. He aimed for her chest. "Freeze!" he barked. "Hands where I can see them." Varela did not freeze. She did not even flinch. She looked at the rifle barrel, then up at his eyes, her expression one of utter disdain. "Put that toy away, human," she said, her voice echoing with a strange harmonic power. "I am not here for your scrap metal." "I said freeze," Jace warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Who are you?" "I am Princess Varela of the Thalzari," she announced, stepping further into the room. "And you have something that belongs to me." Jace laughed, a harsh barking sound. "A princess, right? And I am the Emperor of Mars. You take one more step, and I put a hole in your royal lineage." Varela's eyes narrowed. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You think you can stop me? You think your primitive projectile weapon frightens me? I have torn apart stronger men than you with my bare hands," Jace scoffed. "Yeah? Well, let us see how you handle velocity." He was about to fire, a warning shot, close to her foot, when a low, chittering growl filled the room. It came from the airlock behind her. Jace's eyes flicked up. Emerging from the shadows behind the woman was a nightmare. A creature of chitin and muscle, 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and a face that was all mandibles and malice. Jace's breath hitched. "What the hell is that?" Varela smiled, cold and sharp. "That is my escort. Now stand down." Jace did not stand down. He shifted his aim to the monster. "You bring a beast onto my ship? You are crazy. I am focused," Varela corrected. "Where is the child?" "I am not giving her to you," Jace snapped. "I saw the markings on those drones. They were Imperial. Your people are the ones hunting her." Varela's composure cracked, her face twisted in sudden fury. "Not my people. My enemies. The same enemies who will turn this tin can of a ship into dust if we stay here. I am here to save her. You idiot. Liar!" Jace spat. From the shadows of the crates, a small voice cut through the tension. "She is telling the truth." Jace and Varela both turned. Ilara stood there, the blanket trailing on the floor. She looked at Varela, her eyes wide. "She smells like sadness," Ilara said. "Like the ones who died, but she is angry at them." Varela's expression softened, the rage draining away to reveal a raw, aching exhaustion. She knelt, ignoring Jace's gun. "Child," she said softly. "I know what they did. I know where they took the others, but I need you to tell him. He is too stupid to listen to me." Jace lowered the rifle slightly. Confused. Does the kid trust her? Ilara walked past Jace and stood before the princess. She reached out and touched Varela's face. Then, she knelt on the dirty deck plates. There was a layer of dust on the floor. Ilara used her finger to draw. She drew a circle, then a series of jagged lines around it. "The dead place," Ilara whispered. "That is where they took the other children, where the ships go to die." Varela looked at the drawing, then at Jace. "The Sargasso graveyard." Jace swore. "That is a suicide run. It is an asteroid field made of smashed biospheres. The navigation hazards alone are lethal." Varela stood up, towering over him. "Then you had better be a good pilot, because that is where we are going." Jace glared at her. I do not take orders from royalty. Varela stepped into his personal space, so close he could smell the ozone and blood on her skin. Then take orders from the fact that a hunter-killer squadron just dropped out of warp 3,000 kilometers off your port bow. As if on cue, the ship's proximity alarm screamed. Jace looked at the sensor panel on the wall. It was lit up like a Christmas tree. 12 targets. Fast movers. Damn it, Jace hissed. He sprinted for the cockpit ladder. Strap in and keep your pet monster under control. The rust bucket was a freighter, not a fighter, but Jace Reiner had modified the engines until they were dangerously overpowered. He slammed the throttle forward and the ship lurched away from the refueling platform just as a plasma torpedo vaporized the docking arm. Varela strapped herself into the co-pilot seat. The Hunter, too large for a chair, braced itself in the corridor, its claws digging into the floor grating for stability. They are fast, Jace yelled over the roar of the engines. Bounty drones, sleek models. They are going to try to board us. Can you outrun them? Varela asked, her fingers flying over the weapons console. In a straight line? No. In the debris field? Maybe. Jace threw the ship into a corkscrew spin, diving toward a cluster of floating wreckage. The artificial gravity compensators whined, struggling to keep up. Varela watched the tactical screen. They are not firing to kill. They want the engine. They want to disable us. They want the girl alive, Jace grunted, wrestling with the yoke. Hold on. I am going to cut the gravity. It gives us more power to the thrusters. Wait, Varela started, but Jace punched the button. The hum of the gravity drive died. Instantly, the world went weightless. Varela floated up against her straps. In the back, she heard the Hunter roar as it lost its footing. The drones swarmed. 3 of them latched onto the hull, their magnetic clamps thudding against the metal. They are boarding, Varela shouted. Hull breach in the cargo bay. Jace unbuckled. You fly? I will handle the unwanted guests. Me? Varela stared at him. I do not know how to fly this heap of junk. It is a ship, Jace yelled, pushing off the console and floating toward the hatch. If it has thrusters, you can fly it. Keep us in the shadow of the debris. He grabbed his rifle and a combat knife, kicking off the bulkhead to propel himself down the corridor. Varela cursed in 3 languages. Grabbing the yoke, she hauled the ship into a tight turn, skimming the surface of a shattered frigate. In the cargo bay, the airlock blew inward. The explosive decompression was brief. The atmospheric shields flickered on instantly, but the violence of it sent crates spinning through the zero-gravity air. 3 machines floated in. They were sleek, silver arachnids with red optical sensors and multi-jointed limbs ending in plasma cutters. Jace drifted behind a floating shipping container. He anchored himself with one hand and fired. The slug hit the lead drone in the central eye, shattering the lens. The machine spasmed and drifted backward. The other 2 turned toward him, their cutters glowing hot. Jace pushed off, twisting in midair to avoid a slash of superheated energy. He grabbed a ceiling strut, swung his legs around, and kicked the second drone into the wall. Behind him, a 3rd drone lunged. Jace could not turn in time. A blur of violet motion shot past him. Varela had left the cockpit. She had engaged the autopilot and came back to the fight. She moved in 0G with a liquid grace, her body adapting instantly to the lack of weight. She did not have a gun. She had a short, curved blade made of Thalzari glass steel. She tackled the drone in midair, wrapping her legs around its chassis. With a primal scream, she drove the blade into the drone's neck joint, severing the command circuits. Sparks showered around them like fiery confetti. Jace fired again, finishing off the drone he had kicked. The cargo bay fell silent, save for the crackle of severed wires and the heavy breathing of the 2 warriors. They floated there, surrounded by drifting debris. Varela pushed herself off the dead machine and drifted toward Jace. Her tunic was torn at the shoulder, revealing a nasty burn from a plasma graze. "You left the cockpit," Jace accused, though his voice lacked heat. "Autopilot." Varela panted. "And you looked like you needed help. I had it under control. You were about to be dissected." They stared at each other, floating in the void. The adrenaline fading, the hostility between them shifted into something else, a recognition. Jace looked at the burn on her shoulder. "You are hurt." "It is nothing," Varela said, but her voice was weak. The golden light that had been in her eyes since the ritual was fading, leaving them dull and dark. The physical toll of the summoning, combined with the fight, was crashing down on her. She wavered, her eyes rolling back. "Varela?" Jace reached out. She went limp, drifting listlessly in the air. Jace caught her, wrapping one arm around her waist and the other behind her head. He pulled her close, anchoring his boots to a floor grate. She had heavy, solid muscle and bone, but in the weightlessness, she felt fragile. Her head lolled against his chest. Jace looked down at her face. The arrogance was gone. She just looked tired and young, too young to be leading an army of monsters. He felt a strange tightening in his chest. He had hated her kind for 20 years. He had fought wars against her empire, but holding her now, he didn't feel hate. He felt the same protective urge he felt for the girl. Varela's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him, confused for a second. She felt the warmth of his body, the strength of his arm holding her. She stayed there for a beat too long. Her hand came up, resting on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, steady, slow, strong. "Jace," she whispered. The name sounded strange on her tongue. Jace didn't move. "You are okay, princess. I have got you." The softness in his voice seemed to startle her. She stiffened, the walls slamming back up. She pushed herself away from him, floating back a few feet. "I am fine," she said, her voice sharp again. "Just energy depletion. Do not touch me." Jace held up his hands, masking the hurt with a shrug. "Just making sure you did not crack your head open. We need that royal brain of yours to open the doors when we get there." Varela smoothed her tunic, refusing to look at him. "Get back to the pilot's seat. We have a graveyard to find." She turned and kicked off toward the passenger quarters, fleeing the moment as fast as she could. Varela sat in the small bunk room, staring at the metal wall. She touched her shoulder where the plasma had burned her. It stung, but the pain was grounding. She closed her eyes, and the darkness of the ship was replaced by the memory of another darkness. Flashback. The air in the lab smelled of antiseptic and ozone. It was cold, so cold it burned the lungs. Varela was 12 years old. She was holding the hand of her younger sister, Vanya. Vanya was 10, small for her age, with eyes the color of pale lilacs. "Do I have to go in?" Vanya whispered, looking at the glass tube. It was filled with green liquid. Wires hung from the ceiling like mechanical vines. The tall man in the white coat smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "It is just a checkup, Little Highness. To make you strong. Like the ancient heroes." Varela squeezed Vanya's hand. "It is okay. Van, I will be right here. I promise." She watched Vanya step into the tube. She watched the liquid rise. She watched Vanya smile at her through the glass, brave and terrified. Then the alarm screamed. The liquid turned red. The man in the white coat started shouting at his assistants. "Process failure. Genetic rejection. Abort. Varela ran to the glass. She pounded on it. Vanya was screaming, but the sound was drowned by the fluid. Her skin was rippling, changing, her beautiful face warping into something unrecognizable. Open it, Varela screamed. Let her out. The glass shattered, but it was too late. The thing that fell out of the tube was not Vanya. It was a twisted lump of biology, breathing its last, agonizing breaths. Varela fell to her knees, the green fluid soaking her ceremonial dress. She looked up at the scientist. He was taking notes. He was not sad. He was disappointed in the data. End flashback. Varela snapped her eyes open, gasping for air. The memory was a physical weight on her chest. That scientist had been a subordinate of Admiral Kazior. The same faction, the same cold calculation. They were doing it again, but this time they were not using Thalzari children. They were using humans, because humans were disposable. Varela stood up. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so old and deep it felt like magma. Never again, she whispered to the empty room. The Sargasso graveyard lived up to its name. It was a sphere of space filled with the corpses of worlds. Jace navigated the rust bucket through the field slowly. Outside the viewport, the sights were surreal and haunting. A massive chunk of a planet drifted by, still holding a frozen ocean and a ruined city on its surface. A forest of crystallized trees floated in the vacuum, their roots dangling into nothingness. Shattered domes, broken space stations, and the twisted hulls of 1,000 ships formed a labyrinth of metal and rock. There, Ilara said from the co-pilot seat. She pointed to a massive, hollowed-out asteroid that looked like a skull. Jace scanned it. Heavy interference. But I am picking up a power signature. Fusion reactor. Big one. That is the station, Varela said, stepping into the cockpit. She had cleaned the blood from her face and bandaged her shoulder. She looked like a weapon again. I am taking us in, Jace said. There is a hangar bay on the equatorial ridge. The force field is down. The ship glided into the darkness of the asteroid's interior. Jace set them down on a rusted landing pad. Suit up, Jace ordered. The atmosphere is thin and probably toxic. They put on rebreather masks. Varela signaled the hunter. The creature uncurled from the corner of the bridge, its bone glaive pulsing with faint energy. Stay close, Varela told the beast. Protect the child. Jace looked at Ilara. You stay on the ship, kid. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but us. Ilara nodded, clutching her blanket. Jace and Varela walked down the ramp onto the station floor. The place was a ruin, covered in dust and dark moss. Cables hung from the ceiling like jungle vines. It is too quiet, Jace murmured, scanning the shadows with his rifle. Varela drew her blade. They are here. I can smell them. The attack did not come with a shout. It came with a skittering sound, like insects on dry leaves. From the vents, from the shadows, from the cracks in the floor, they emerged. Jace shone his tactical light on the nearest one and recoiled. God almighty, and it was a soldier, wearing tattered Imperial armor. But the face inside the helmet was wrong. The jaw was unhinged, splitting wide. The eyes were black voids. One arm was human, the other was a Thalzari claw, grafted on with crude staples and scar tissue. Hybrids. Varela breathed, horror cold in her stomach. They are fusing the DNA. The creature hissed, a sound that was half human scream, half alien click. Fire! Jace yelled. He opened up with the rifle. The heavy slug slammed into the hybrid's chest, knocking it back. But it did not stay down. It scrambled up, leaking black ichor, and charged. More of them poured out, dozens. They moved with a jerky, unnatural speed. Varela leaped forward, her blade a blur of violet light. She decapitated the first one, then spun to slash the legs of a second. "They are mindless," she shouted. "They feel no pain." Jace was firing in controlled bursts, aiming for heads. "Back to back," he roared. They moved together, instinctively finding the rhythm they had discovered in 0G. Jace covered the range. Varela handled the close quarters. The hunter was a whirlwind of destruction, tearing the hybrids apart with brutal efficiency. But there were too many. They were swarming down the walls, dropping from the ceiling. "We need to get to the inner door," Varela yelled, kicking a hybrid into a pit. "The control center is past that bulkhead." Jace slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Move!" They fought their way across the hangar, step by bloody step. The air was filled with the roar of gunfire and the wet tearing of flesh. As they reached the heavy blast door, a massive hybrid, twice the size of the others, dropped in front of them. It had 4 arms, like a mockery of a hunter, but its face was unmistakably human, a twisted, screaming mask of agony. Varela froze. She recognized the face. It was the missing boy from the agate colony. He had grown, warped, aged decades in a matter of weeks. "No," she whispered, her blade lowering. The creature raised a massive hammer made of scrap metal. "Varela!" Jace shouted, shoving her aside. The hammer came down, smashing the floor where she had stood a second before. Jace fired point blank into the creature's face. It roared and backhanded him. Jace flew across the room, slamming into the wall, and he crumpled, his rifle skittering away. "Jace!" Varela screamed. She looked at the monster, the boy she had failed to save. Tears stung her eyes, hot and angry. She raised her blade. "I am sorry," she whispered. She lunged, sliding under the hammer swing, and drove her blade upward into the creature's heart. The monster gasped, a sound that sounded terrifyingly like mama, and collapsed. Varela stood over the body, shaking. The hangar was quiet again, save for the rasp of Jace's breathing across the room. She ran to him. He was groaning, clutching his ribs. "Broken?" she asked, her hands hovering over him. "Cracked." Jace grunted, wincing. "I will live." He looked at the dead monster. "Was that—" "Yes," Varela said, her voice hard as diamond. "That was one of the children." She helped Jace stand. He leaned on her, and this time she did not pull away. She wrapped her arm around his waist, taking his weight. "We are going to kill them all," Jace said, wiping blood from his lip. "Everyone who had a hand in this." Varela looked at the blast door, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "We are not just going to kill them," she said. "We are going to erase them." She signaled the hunter to tear the door open. The beast roared and dug its claws into the steel. Metal shrieked as the path to the inner station was forced open, revealing the dark, beating heart of the nightmare. Varela and Jace stepped through together, into the dark. The darkness in the lower levels of the station was not merely an absence of light, it was a suffocating weight, heavy with the smell of burnt ozone and old blood. Jace Reiner hung suspended in that darkness, his wrists shackled above his head, the cold metal biting into his skin. His ribs, cracked from the fight in the hangar, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony that matched the pulsing of the red emergency lights. But the physical pain was a distant drumbeat compared to the assault on his mind. A Thalzari scientist, a spindly creature with skin the color of bruised plums and eyes that blinked behind thick magnifying lenses, hovered in front of him on a repulsor chair. The creature held a neural spike, a device illegal in 12 systems, and tapped it against Jace's temple. "Look," the scientist hissed, his voice a dry rustle. "Look at the purity." The spike flared. Jace gasped as the vision slammed into his brain. It was not a hallucination. It was a direct feed from the station's archives. He saw rows of glass tanks, hundreds of them. Inside were children, human children, but they were melting. Their flesh was dissolving into a luminescent golden slurry, their screams silent but deafening in the telepathic feedback loop. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" the scientist cooed, adjusting the frequency. "The human genome is so pliable, so eager to be broken down. We strip away the weakness, the mortality, and we are left with the essence, a serum of eternal youth for the Empire's elite." Jace gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face. He tried to look away, but the images were seared onto his retinas. He saw faces he recognized from missing person reports on the frontier networks. He saw the boy from Agate 4. "You are sick," Jace rasped, spitting a glob of blood onto the scientist's pristine white coat. The scientist wiped the spittle away with a look of mild distaste. "We are visionaries, and you are raw material." He leaned in closer, the neural spike humming. "Once we are done extracting your pain threshold data, we will see if a grown human can produce a viable enzyme. I suspect the screaming will be prolonged." Jace hung his head, breathing raggedly. His mind raced, pushing past the horror, searching for an angle, a weakness. He was a ranger. Rangers didn't die in chairs. 30 levels above, in the pristine, vaulted command center of the station. Princess Virella stood unbound but surrounded. Her cousin, Admiral Kazior, sat on a throne made of repurposed starship plating, sipping a glass of iridescent blue wine. Kazior was handsome in the way a knife was handsome, sharp, polished, and cold. He wore the full-dress uniform of a Grand Admiral, but the insignia on his chest was modified, the imperial crest inverted. "You look terrible, cousin," Kazior noted, gesturing with his glass. "That tunic is ruined, and you smell of human sweat." Virella stood tall, her chin lifted. She refused to show fear. She refused to show him the exhaustion that was gnawing at her bones. "Where are the children?" "Kazior?" she demanded. "Safe," Kazior smiled. "Or, at least, their potential is safe." He stood up and walked to the massive viewport that overlooked the station's core. Below them, in the center of the hollowed-out asteroid, a massive machine pulsed with green light. It was a bioreactor, feeding off the harvested DNA. "Do you know what the Council fears most?" "Virella?" Kazior asked, looking down at the reactor. "Not war, not rebellion. Death. They are old. Virella. Valis is 300 years old. His scales are rotting. His mind is fading. He wants more time." Virella's stomach turned. "You are liquefying innocence to make—" "What? A skin cream for politicians? Immortality." Kazior spun around, his eyes blazing with fanaticism. "We have cracked the code. The human genetic sequence, when spliced with our progenitor cells, creates a regenerative loop. We can live forever. Virella, we can rule the galaxy not for a century, but for an eon. And Earth will be our farm, a nursery for the gods." "You are insane," Virella whispered. "You have betrayed everything our bloodline stands for. The Thalzari are protectors, not butchers." Kazior laughed. "History is written by the survivors' cousins. And you are an extinct species." He snapped his fingers. 2 guards, massive hybrids with armored carapaces and dull, obedient eyes, stepped forward. "Take her to the prep room," Kazior ordered. "Her royal DNA should add a nice vintage to the next batch." Jace watched the scientist turn away to check a monitor. The guard standing by the door was a hulking brute, a lower-caste Thalzari mercenary who looked bored. He was chewing on a stimulant root, his weapon slung lazily over one shoulder. Jace tested the shackles. They were magnetic, no lock to pick, no chain to break, but the wall mount. The bolts were rusted. The humidity in this hellhole was eating the station alive. He needed a distraction. He needed 1 second of chaos. "Hey, ugly," Jace called out to the guard. The guard grunted, looking over. "Yeah, you." Jace grinned, his teeth stained red. "Your mother was a garden slug, wasn't she? I can tell by the slime trail you left walking in here." The guard roared, dropping the root. He stomped forward, raising a massive fist. "Silence him!" the scientist shrieked. "Do not damage the subject's brain." The guard ignored the scientist. He stepped into Jace's range, winding up for a punch that would shatter a jaw. Jace waited. He watched the shift in the guard's weight. He watched the hips turn. Now. Jace swung his legs up, curling his body into a tight ball. He didn't aim for a kick. He aimed for a capture. His thighs clamped around the guard's thick neck like a steel trap. The momentum of the guard's punch threw him off balance, and Jace used that leverage. He twisted his hips violently, putting every ounce of his ranger strength into the torque. There was a sickening crack, loud and wet, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. The guard went limp instantly, his spinal cord severed. Jace didn't stop. He used the dead weight of the guard's falling body to wrench the rusted bolts from the wall. The metal screamed, gave way, and Jace dropped to the floor, landing in a crouch. The scientist spun around, eyes wide behind the lenses. He fumbled for a pistol on the tray. Jace was already moving. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't use his hands. He used the heavy magnetic cuffs still locked on his wrists. He swung them like a flail. The metal impacted the scientist's skull with a brutal crunch. The creature collapsed, the neural spike clattering across the floor. Jace stood over him, breathing hard. He keyed the release code into the scientist's console. He had watched the reflection in the creature's glasses, and the cuffs clicked open. He rubbed his raw wrists. He grabbed the guard's pulse rifle and the scientist's keycard. He looked at the screen, at the paused image of the melting children. "I am coming," he whispered to the silent faces. The prep room was quiet. Varela sat on a diagnostic table. The 2 hybrid guards stood by the door, motionless. They were simple creatures, their minds stripped of complexity, leaving only obedience and base instinct. Varela closed her eyes. She focused on her breathing. She focused on her body chemistry. Valzari royalty were not just political leaders, they were biological pinnacles. Their pheromones were potent, capable of inducing fear, loyalty, or arousal in their own species. She pushed a scent from her glands, a subtle, musky signal. It was the scent of a distressed mate, a chemical plea for protection that bypassed the higher brain functions and hit the lizard brain directly. The guard on the left twitched. He sniffed the air. He turned his head toward her, his pupils dilating. The programming fought the instinct. His face contorted. "Help me," Varela whispered. Her voice was low, trembling. "The strap. It hurts." The guard took a step forward, then another. The second guard growled, confused by the conflicting signals. The first guard reached out to adjust the restraint on her wrist. His hand was shaking. Varela waited until he was close enough to smell the blood in his veins. Her hand moved faster than the eye could track. She didn't have a knife. She didn't need one. She had the cathal, the retractable bone spur hidden in the wrist of every high-born female. A secret defense mechanism evolved for mating rituals gone wrong. The spur, sharp as a razor, snapped out from her forearm. She drove it into the soft tissue under the guard's chin, punching straight up into the brainstem. He dropped without a sound. The second guard roared, raising his weapon. Varela rolled off the table, grabbing the falling guard's sidearm. She fired from the hip. The blue plasma bolt caught the second guard in the throat. He gurgled and slumped against the wall. Varela stood up, retracting the bone spur. She wiped it on her tunic. Her face was a mask of cold, imperial judgment. "No mercy," she said to the corpses. "Not today." She grabbed a rifle and sprinted into the corridor. The alarm was already sounding. The reactor core was a cavernous hellscape of piping, steam, and the throbbing green light of the biovat. Catwalks crisscrossed the open space, suspended over a drop that went down into the grinding machinery of the station's heart. Jace burst through the maintenance door on the east side. Varela kicked open the blast doors on the west. They saw each other across the gap. For a second, time seemed to hang suspended. He was covered in blue blood and grime. She was sleek, fierce, a Valkyrie of violet vengeance. Then the hybrids swarmed. They poured out of the shadows, dropping from the pipes, dozens of them. These were the combat models, heavily armored, armed with shock batons and flechette guns. Jace didn't yell a warning, he just opened fire. He laid down a suppressing wall of plasma that cut the first wave in half. Varela vaulted over the railing, landing on a lower gantry. She spun, her rifle barking, taking out snipers in the rafters. "Jace!" she screamed. "The control node! On the central pillar! I see it!" Jace yelled back. He sprinted along the catwalk. A hybrid lunged at him. Jace slid underneath its swing, shooting it in the gut, and kept running. Varela was moving parallel to him. She was a dancer of death. She used the momentum of her enemies against them, throwing them over railings, dodging fire with impossible flexibility. They met at the central junction. They stood back to back, a circle of death amidst the chaos. "Hi!" Varela shouted. Jace ducked instantly. Varela fired over his head, killing a hybrid that had been about to drop on him. "Low!" Jace barked. Varela jumped, tucking her legs. Jace swept his rifle around, blowing the legs off 3 attackers charging her flank. They moved in perfect sync. There were no words needed. It was raw, unfiltered synergy, a connection forged in the fire of survival. He was the hammer, she was the scalpel. He was the brute force, she was the precision. "Reloading!" Jace yelled, tossing his empty weapon at a hybrid's face. Varela handed him her sidearm without looking, drawing a combat knife she had scavenged. "Cover me!" Jace caught the pistol and fired 2 shots, clearing a path. Varela sprinted to the control node. She ripped the panel off and jammed her hands into the wiring. "Shields down!" she yelled. "Blast doors sealing!" The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off the reinforcements. The remaining hybrids in the room were trapped with them. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of brutal close-quarters violence. When the last body hit the grating, the silence that followed was deafening. Jace dropped the pistol. He leaned against the railing, his chest heaving. Varela stood amidst the carnage, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to crash. We did it," Jace wheezed. Varela looked at him. Her eyes were wild, dark pupils swallowing the violet irises. "Not yet," she said. She grabbed his hand, not gently. She pulled him toward the observation chamber adjacent to the core, a small glass-walled room that overlooked the stars and the burning wreckage of the graveyard fleet. She punched the door lock. It slid open. She dragged him inside and slammed the lock shut. The room was quiet. The hum of the reactor was muffled here. The only light came from the stars and the distant explosions of the battle outside. They stood there, panting, bleeding, smelling of death and sweat. Jace looked at her. He saw the cracks in the armor. He saw the woman beneath the princess, the terrifying, beautiful force of nature that had just fought through hell for children that weren't even her own. Varela looked at him. She saw the soldier who had refused to break. She saw the man who had looked at her monsters and seen allies. The tension that had been building between them, in the smuggler ship, in the zero-G fight, in the arguments, snapped. Varela didn't speak. She reached up and undid the top clasp of her tunic. Her fingers were stained with hybrid blood. "If I die tomorrow," she said, her voice rough, devoid of any royal polish, "I want to feel something tonight." She let the tunic fall open. Jace didn't hesitate. He crossed the distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was a collision. It was teeth clashing, breath mingling, a desperate, hungry devouring. He pinned her against the cold glass wall. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the life in him. They sank to the floor. The glass was cold against her back, but she burned. She burned with a heat that terrified him. They tore at each other's clothes. There was no gentleness here. This was not making love, this was an exorcism. They were purging the horror of the torture room, the grief of the dead sister, the rage of the stolen children. Virella cried out, her nails digging into Jace's back, scoring lines in his skin. Jace buried his face in her neck, tasting salt and ozone. They moved together with the same frantic rhythm of their fight, a desperate race to find oblivion in each other's bodies. I was angry. It was tender. It was the only thing that made sense in a universe that had gone mad. When it was over, they lay tangled together on the floor, the starlight washing over their sweat-slicked skin. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of the aftermath. Jace propped himself up on one elbow. He looked down at her. Her hair was a silver mess spread across the black glass. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand, the hand that had snapped a neck an hour ago, was trembling. "You burn like a war," he whispered. Virella opened her eyes. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no wall, no princess, no commander, just Virella. She smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips. "I was born from one," she replied softly. She pulled his head down to her chest, holding him there as the stars watched them. Two broken things trying to make a hole in the dark. The silence in the observation chamber did not last. It was broken not by a siren, but by a vibration. A deep, subsonic thrum that resonated through the deck plates and into the bones of the two warriors lying on the floor. Virella sat up, her movement fluid and sharp. The vulnerability she had shown moments ago vanished, replaced by a terrifying resolve. She buttoned her tunic, her fingers moving with precision, covering the skin Jace had just touched. Her eyes, however, remained changed. The gold flecks in her violet irises were burning with a psychic intensity that made the air around her shimmer. She reached out, not to Jace, but to the invisible network that bound her to the ancient warriors she had awakened on the moon. "Hunt," she commanded. Her voice was not spoken aloud. It was a telepathic shout that echoed through the station's superstructure. Jace pulled his boots on, wincing as his cracked ribs protested. "What is the play? Princess, we cannot clear this station alone. There are hundreds of those hybrids between us and the Briggs." Virella stood, smoothing her hair back. "We are not alone. I have sent the hunters." She closed her eyes, projecting a holographic map of the station into the center of the room using the tactical table. Red dots swarmed the lower levels, the hybrids, but moving against them were 6 larger, brighter signatures, the hunters. "They are moving to the detention blocks," Virella said, her finger tracing the path. "I have given them free rein. They will not stop for walls. They will not stop for pain. They will clear a path for us." Jace grabbed his rifle. "And the children?" Virella looked at him, and for a second, the mask slipped again. Save them. Jace, I will deal with my cousin. The station became a slaughterhouse. The hunters did not fight like soldiers. They fought like natural disasters. In Sector 4, a hunter named Rak, a giant with a carapace the color of dried blood, smashed through a reinforced bulkhead. He did not use explosives. He simply ran at it, his shoulder dropping, his momentum carrying 5 tons of kinetic energy. The metal buckled and shrieked, tearing open like wet paper. Inside the corridor, a squad of hybrid soldiers opened fire. Plasma bolts scorched Rock's armor, burning black craters into the biosteel. Rock did not slow down. He roared, a sound that shattered glass in the overhead lights, and waded into the fire. He grabbed a hybrid by the head and the waist, tearing the creature in half with a wet, sickening rip. He used the legs as a bludgeon to crush the skull of the next attacker. It was brutal, primal, and terrifyingly effective. Jace moved through the wake of this destruction. He sprinted down corridors slick with ichor, stepping over the mangled remains of the enemy. He was heading for the East Wing, where Alara's map had indicated the primary holding cells were located. He reached the door to the nursery. It was locked, sealed with a heavy encryption algorithm. Jace didn't hack it. He blew the hinges with a shaped charge and kicked it in. The room inside was freezing. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, bathing the room in a soft, ghostly blue light. Inside each pod was a child. There were dozens of them. Jace ran to the nearest pod. It was a boy, maybe 6 years old. He was pale, his lips blue. Jace checked the vitals on the external monitor. Stable, sedated. He exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. We got them. He reached for the release latch. Stop! The voice came from a speaker in the corner. It was Kazior. Touch that latch, Mr. Reiner, and you turn this room into a tomb. Look closer. Look at the base of their skulls. Jace leaned in, pressing his face to the glass. There, just below the boy's hairline, was a small metallic node blinking with a slow red light. A neural detonator, Kazior purred, wired directly to the brainstem. If the stasis field is interrupted without the proper code, or if the child is moved more than 10 meters from the node's receiver. Pop. No pain. Just instant cessation of life. Jace's hand froze on the latch. You sick son of a bitch. Kazior laughed. I prefer to think of it as an insurance policy. You can have the station, Ranger, but you cannot have the harvest. The link is cut out. Jace stared at the blinking red light. He was an expert in demolition, but this was biotech, alien and complex. He tapped his comms. Virella, we have a problem. Virella was moving toward the command spire, her blade drawn. She heard Jace's voice, tight with panic, and her heart hammered. Fix it. Jace, she whispered. You are the tech. I am the blade. I cannot help you from here. She rounded a corner and found her path blocked. A massive energy shield shimmered across the hallway. Behind it stood 3 hybrids, armed with heavy repeaters. Virella didn't stop. She reached out with her mind, finding the nearest hunter, Vorl. To me, the ceiling above the hybrids exploded. Vorl, a sleek 4-armed hunter with blades grafted into his forearms, dropped from the ventilation shaft. He landed amidst the soldiers, a whirlwind of violence. The hybrids spun around, but they were too late. Vorl impaled 2 of them instantly, lifting them off the ground. The third fired point blank into Vorl's chest. The hunter shuddered, violet blood spraying the walls. But he didn't fall. He grabbed the soldier's head and crushed it against the floor. Virella stepped through the deactivated shield as Vorl slumped against the wall. The hunter looked at her. His breathing was wet, rattling in his chest. The plasma wound was fatal. She could see his heart beating sluggishly through the charred ribcage. He looked at her with ancient, milky eyes. Karesh Vala, he rasped, the old tongue. The path is clear. Virella stopped. She placed her hand on his bloodied snout. Go to the ancestors, brother. You have earned your rest. Vorl exhaled one last time, and his head bowed. Virella swallowed the grief, a hard, sharp lump in her throat, and kept running. She could grieve later. Right now, she has a cousin to kill. Jace was sweating. Drops of it fell from his nose, splashing onto the glass of the stasis pod. He had pried the casing off the neural detonator on the first child. The mechanism was microscopic. A nest of filaments thinner than human hair pulsed with energy. Bucky, give me a schematic, Jace muttered to his VI. Analyzing. The AI chirped. Structure is volatile. 3 primary leads. If you cut the power, it triggers. If you cut the ground, it triggers. You have to bypass the signal loop. Which one is the loop? Jace demanded, his vibro cutter hovering millimeters from the boy's neck. Unclear. The wiring is color shifted. It could be the blue filament or the translucent one. 50-50, Jace growled. Great. He looked at the boy's sleeping face. He thought about the girl, Ilara, waiting on his ship. He thought about Virella, fighting alone in the dark. He took a breath, steadying his hand. He isolated the translucent wire. It hummed with a faint rhythmic frequency. Trust your gut. Reiner. He snipped the wire. The red light on the node turned solid green. The detonator disengaged with a soft click. Jace sagged against the pod, laughing breathlessly. 1 down. He looked down the row, 49 to go. Work fast. Bucky, Jace said, moving to the next pod. We are on the clock. Virella kicked open the doors to the Admiral's sanctum. The room was a sphere of glass and steel, suspended above the station's gravity drive. The view was dizzying, a 300-degree panorama of the asteroid field and the distant stars. Admiral Kazior stood in the center of the room. He was waiting for her. He held a long, elegant dual saber, a weapon of refined cruelty. You are late, Kazior said, checking an imaginary watch. I expected you 10 minutes ago. Virella walked into the room, her own bioblade extending from her wrist. Where are the evacuation ships? Kazior? Gone, he smiled. Sent to the rendezvous point. With the genetic data securely uploaded, the station is just a husk now. A tomb for you and your pet human. He tapped a control on his wrist. Suddenly, the floor lurched. The artificial gravity in the room shifted 90 degrees. Virella fell, slamming into what was previously the wall. The glass beneath her cracked. Kazior, wearing magnetic boots, walked calmly up the wall, defying the physics of the room. Adaptation. Virella, he taunted, looking down at her. That is the key to survival. You cling to the old ways. I embrace the new. He lunged, diving from the ceiling. Virella rolled, the saber slashing the air where her head had been. She kicked off the glass, flipping in midair to land on a support strut. She was disoriented. Her inner ear screamed in protest as the gravity shifted again, this time pulling them toward the ceiling. Virella grabbed a light fixture, dangling as the room spun. Kazior landed gracefully on a ceiling panel, thrusting his saber at her exposed flank. Virella parried, sparks flying as bone met energy. She swung her legs, kicking him in the chest, but his personal shield absorbed the blow. You cannot win, Kazior shouted, slashing at her arm. I am the future! Virella dropped, falling through the chaotic gravity well. She landed on the central console, crouching low. The future, she spat, wiping blood from a cut on her cheek. You are a parasite. She closed her eyes for a split second. She didn't look at him. She sensed him. She sensed the displacement of air, the hum of his weapon. When he attacked from behind, she didn't turn. She simply dropped flat. Kazior's blade passed inches above her spine. Varela thrust her blade upward, blindly, guided only by instinct and hate. The bio-blade punched through the bottom of the console, through the metal casing, and into Kazior's groin. He screamed, a high, undignified sound. Varela rolled, sweeping his legs. He fell, his magnetic boots losing traction as the pain broke his concentration. She was on him in a heartbeat. She pinned him to the floor, her blade at his throat. The gravity stabilized, returning to normal. They lay panting on the deck. Kazior looked up at her, his eyes wide with shock. You would kill your own blood. You are not my blood, Varela whispered, leaning close. You are a disease. She slashed. It was a clean cut. Kazior choked, his hands flying to his neck, but it was too late. The architect of the harvest died drowning in his own ambition. Varela stood up. She didn't look back at the body. Jace, she said in her comms, it is done. Get the children. The hangar bay was chaotic. The station was breaking apart, the structural integrity failing as the gravity drive spun out of control. Jace was running, pushing a grav sled loaded with 20 sleeping children. He was covered in sweat and grime, his hands bleeding from the delicate work of the detonators. Only 20? Varela shouted, running to meet him at the ramp of the rust bucket. We lost the east wing, Jace yelled over the roar of collapsing metal. The corridor collapsed before I could get to the second nursery. The hunters. They held the ceiling up as long as they could. Varela looked past him. She saw the dust cloud where the east wing had been. She felt the psychic snap of 3 more lives extinguishing. The hunters had turned themselves into living pillars, their bones cracking under the weight of the collapsing station to give Jace time to escape. They died well, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. We have to go. Jace grabbed her arm. The reactor is going critical. They shoved the grav sled into the cargo hold. Ilara was there, eyes wide, helping to strap the sleeping children in. Jace scrambled to the cockpit. Varela took the co-pilot seat. Punch it, she screamed. The rust bucket fired its main thrusters. They shot out of the hangar bay just as the station began to implode. The asteroid collapsed in on itself, a massive cloud of dust and fire swallowing the graveyard. Jace fought the shockwave, his hands dancing over the controls. Coordinates locked, he shouted, jumping to warp in 3, 2, 1. The stars elongated. The familiar blue tunnel of hyperspace enveloped them. Jace slumped back in his seat, laughing hysterically. We made it. We actually made it. Varela didn't laugh. She stared at the swirling blue light. It was too easy. The fleet Kazior mentioned. Where were they? We are not safe yet, she said quietly. They spent 4 hours in warp, 4 hours of tending to the children, of checking vitals, of sitting in silence holding hands as the adrenaline faded into a bone-deep exhaustion. When the nav computer chirped, signaling their arrival at the rendezvous point, a neutral station in the Veil Nebula, Jace smiled at her. We get them to the medics, we get our ship fixed, and then we disappear. He said, you and me. We go somewhere the Empire cannot find us. Varela looked at him, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in years. Somewhere with green grass, she suggested, and wind. Drop out in 5 seconds, the computer announced. The blue tunnel collapsed. The stars returned. And so did the nightmare. They didn't drop out into empty space. They dropped out into the middle of a formation. 50 Imperial warships hung in the void, their cannons charged and locked onto the tiny freighter. Jace froze. No. A heavy cruiser, the flagship Indomitable, hailed them. A hologram of High Counselor Valis appeared on the dashboard. Princess Varela. Valis boomed, his face a mask of sorrowful authority. You are accused of treason, kidnapping, and the murder of Admiral Cassior. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. It is a lie, Jace shouted at the screen. We saved them. Cassior was the monster. Valis didn't even look at Jace. The narrative has already been written. Human. The galaxy knows that the Mad Princess kidnapped these children for a dark ritual. We are here to rescue them from you. Varela stared at the screen. She saw the trap. It was perfect. Cassior was the scapegoat, but the program would continue, and she would be the villain of the story. She looked at Jace. His hand was hovering over the weapon systems. Don't, she said softly. They will kill us, Jace said, his voice breaking. If we fight, they will destroy the ship, Varela said, and the children will die. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. We have to surrender. It is the only way they live. Jace looked at her, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. I promised you. I promised we would go somewhere quiet. Varela leaned over and kissed him. It was a soft, lingering kiss, tasting of salt and goodbye. We will, she whispered, just not today. She keyed the comms. This is Princess Varela and we surrender. The boarding was clinical. Stormtroopers in white armor flooded the ship. They shoved Jace to the deck, binding his hands with heavy suppression cuffs. They secured the children, pushing the grav sleds out with efficient, uncaring speed. Varela stood tall in the center of the bridge. She allowed them to shackle her. An Imperial medic approached her, holding a pneumatic syringe. Stasis protocol, the medic muttered. Order of the Council. Jace was struggling against two troopers. Varela! Tell them the truth. Varela looked at him one last time. The troopers were dragging him away, toward the prisoner transport shuttle. He looked desperate, broken, a man watching his world burn down for the second time. She looked at Valis's hologram, which was still watching with a gloating, silent satisfaction. The medic pressed the syringe to her neck. The cold spread instantly, freezing her blood, slowing her heart. Her vision began to gray at the edges. Her limbs turned to heavy stone. She focused all her remaining will on Jace, and then on the camera transmitting to the High Council. I will not forget you, she whispered, her voice slurring as the ice took hold. Her eyes locked onto the lens, burning with a cold, eternal fury, or forgive them. The darkness took her. The alarm on the deep space penal colony of Tartarus did not ring. It screamed. It was a sonic drill designed to paralyze the nervous system, a sound that turned bones to jelly and thoughts to static. In the chaos of Cell Block D, however, the scream of the alarm was drowned out by the roar of 3,000 desperate men. Jace Reiner stood in the center of the mess hall, the metal tray in his hand bent nearly in half. He was thinner than he had been 6 months ago. His beard was longer, streaked with premature gray, and his skin was pale from the lack of stasis light. But the muscle underneath was corded steel, forged in the daily grind of the asteroid mines. The riot was not an accident. It was a precision strike. Across the room, a heavy blast door hissed open. Warden Krell stepped through, flanked by 6 riot droids. Krell was a sadist who wore a pristine white uniform in a place made of grease and filth. He held a neural whip, a device that could boil the blood in a man's veins with a touch. Get back, Krell bellowed, his voice amplified. Any prisoner not on the ground in 5 seconds will be liquidated. Jace did not get on the ground. He looked at his left forearm. Under the grime and the prison tattoos, there was a small, hard lump beneath the skin, a shard of the Thalzari summoning crystal, pressed there by Varela in the frantic moments before their capture. She had whispered that it was a beacon. Jace had discovered it was a key. He pressed his thumb against the lump, hard enough to bruise. The crystal resonated with his bioelectric field. It sent a pulse, a localized high-frequency scramble signal out into the room. The riot droids froze. Their optical sensors cycled from red to dead black. They collapsed, heavy metal hitting the deck plates with a thunderous crash. Krell froze, his whip raised. He looked at the fallen droids, then at Jace. For the first time in 6 months, the warden looked afraid. Jace moved. He did not run. He flowed, closing the 20 meters between them before Krell could fumble for his sidearm. Jace tackled him, driving the warden into the wall. The neural whip clattered to the floor. Krell clawed at Jace's face, his nails digging in, but Jace felt nothing. He was running on 6 months of cold rage. "You put me in the hole for 30 days because I looked at you wrong," Jace whispered, his voice a rusted rasp. "You let the guards beat the kid in cell 4 until he stopped breathing." "I am the law!" Krell shrieked, spitting blood. Jace grabbed Krell by the throat and the belt, lifting him effortlessly. He slammed the warden down onto the edge of a steel table. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly loud. Krell went limp, wheezing, his spine shattered. Jace stripped the armor from the warden's body. He pulled the chest plate over his own ragged jumpsuit. He strapped the magnetic boots to his feet. He picked up the heavy pulse rifle Krell had dropped. The other prisoners were watching him, a circle of savage faces pausing in their violence. "Go!" Jace shouted, pointing to the open airlock. "Take the shuttles. Burn it all down." As the mob surged past him, Jace turned the other way. He wasn't going for the shuttles. He was going for the evidence locker, where they kept the long-range comms arrays. He had a call to make, and then he had a princess to find. Waking from Imperial stasis was not like waking from sleep. It was like drowning in reverse. Varela gasped, her lungs burning as the liquid oxygen was purged from her system. She fell forward, coughing up blue fluid, shivering violently on the cold metal floor. Her skin felt brittle, like glass ready to shatter. She expected the sterile white walls of the Imperial Detention Center. She expected the cold face of Counselor Vallis gloating over her frozen form. Instead, she saw tapestry. Rich, heavy fabrics hung from the walls, depicting scenes of the old wars, Thalzari hunters riding beasts across the plains of a burning moon. The air smelled of incense and ancient dust. Varela pushed herself up, her limbs trembling. She was in a private sanctum lit by flickering oil lamps. "Drink," a voice commanded. A goblet was pressed to her lips. Varela drank greedily. It was spiced wine, warm and restorative. She looked up. Sitting on a high-backed chair in the shadows was a figure draped in heavy robes. The face was hidden by a veil of gold chain, but the hands gripping the armrests were unmistakably Thalzari, long, four-fingered, and powerful despite the age spot. "Who are you?" Varela rasped. "Why am I not in a cell?" The figure leaned forward. The gold chains chimed softly. "Because money buys loyalty, but blood buys silence," the woman said. She reached up and removed the veil. Varela stopped breathing. The face looking back at her was a map of her own history. The eyes were the same violet, though faded by time. The ridges on the forehead were sharp and regal. "Grandmother?" Varela whispered. "Empress Ovara?" The old woman smiled, a dry, cracking expression. "Deposed Empress," she corrected, "or matriarch, or that crazy old witch in the Outer Rim. I have had many titles since the Council exiled me." Varela tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Ovara gestured, and a servant droid caught her. settling her into a chair. "I thought you were dead," Varela said. "They told me you died in the uprising." "They lie," Ovara said, her voice gaining strength. "That is what this empire does best. They lie about the past. They lie about bioprograms. They lie about us." She stood up, walking to a large window that looked out over a barren, rocky landscape. "I watched your trial," Ovara said. "I watched you scream at them about the children. You reminded me of myself, before I let them clip my wings. This empire forgets what we were. Varela. We were not politicians. We were not scientists making abominations in tubes. We were guardians." She turned back, her eyes blazing. "I used the last of my fortune to bribe the stasis technicians. They swapped your pod with a clone. Valis thinks you are still on ice." Varela looked at her hands. The strength was returning slowly. "And Jace? The human?" Ovara scoffed. "Humans are resourceful. My spies tell me Tartarus burned 3 days ago. A stolen patrol ship was tracked leaving the sector. He is alive." Varela felt a sob catch in her throat. She pushed it down, turning it into fuel. "Where is he?" "Waiting," Ovara said. "On the dead world of Nocturne, the place where our ancestors first looked up at the stars. Go to him, granddaughter, and then take my ship and finish what you started." Nocturne was a world of ash and bone. It was the original homeworld of the Thalzari, abandoned thousands of years ago when the sun began to expand. Now, it was a twilight realm of crumbling temples and petrified forests. Jace sat on the steps of the great ziggurat, cleaning his stolen rifle. He had not slept in 4 days. The armor he wore was scuffed and scorched, mismatched pieces scavenged from his escape. He heard the ship before he saw it, a sleek, black yacht, devoid of imperial markings, descended through the clouds. It landed silently in the dust of the plaza. Jace stood up. He didn't raise his rifle. He knew that engine signature. The ramp lowered. Varela walked out. She wore black combat leathers given to her by her grandmother, and a cloak that billowed in the hot wind. She looked thinner, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes haunted by the months of darkness. Jace took a step forward. Then he stopped. The last time he had seen her. She was being frozen alive. He had failed her. He had promised to keep them safe, and he had ended up in a cage while she became a trophy. Varela stopped too. She looked at him, at the gray in his beard, the new scars on his face, the hardness that hadn't been there before. "Jace," she breathed. He didn't say anything. He just crossed the distance. He didn't care about the dust or the heat. He grabbed her, pulling her into him with a force that knocked the wind out of her. She buried her face in his neck, clutching the back of his armor. They didn't kiss. They just held on. Two survivors clinging to wreckage in a storm. "I thought I lost you," Jace whispered into her hair. His voice cracked. "I thought I lost you for good." "You cannot lose a war," Varela mumbled against his chest, pulling back to look at him. "And that is what I am. Remember." He looked at her face, tracing the line of her jaw with a thumb rough from the mines. There was shame in his eyes. "I let them take you," he said. "I let them take the kids." Varela shook her head fiercely. "No. You survived. That is the only thing that matters. We survived." She kissed him then. It wasn't the desperate, angry kiss of the reactor room. It was a kiss of relief, of sorrow, of a deep, aching need to bridge the months of separation. It tasted of dust and tears. When they broke apart, the fire was back in her eyes. "Ovara gave me the schematics," she said, her voice hardening. "The children from the station, the ones we didn't save, were moved. Where? Jace asked, his hand dropping to his gun. Aurora Prime, Varela said. The capital, under the Science Citadel. Jace let out a low whistle. The most fortified square kilometer in the galaxy. We cannot just kick down the door. Varela, we would need an army. Varela turned back to the ship. A massive shape was moving down the ramp, guided by the faint vibrations of the ground. We do not have an army, she said. We have something better. Kor, the blind hunter, stepped into the light. He was older than the others, his chitin gray and scarred from 1,000 battles. His eyes were covered by a thick metal band, fused to his skull. He did not see with light, he saw with time, sensing the future movements of his prey before they happened. He chittered, a sound like dry leaves, and bowed his head toward Jace. He remembers you, Varela said. He says your heartbeat is louder than the storm. Jace looked at the monster. Can he fight? Varela smiled, a cold, dangerous expression. He does not fight Jace. He ends. The plan was madness. It relied on arrogance, timing, and the colossal hubris of the Imperial Senate. The coronation of the new emperor, a puppet chosen by the council to replace the ailing dynasty, was tonight. The Citadel would be open. The elite of the galaxy would be there, drinking wine and pretending the universe wasn't burning at the edges. Varela and Jace stood in the cargo hold of Ovara's yacht, which was now disguised as a diplomatic courier vessel. Jace tugged at the collar of his tunic. It was high-collared velvet, blue and gold. He looked ridiculous, and he knew it. I feel like a wrapped candy bar, Jace grumbled, trying to hide the heavy blaster pistol strapped to his thigh under the fabric. You look like a diplomat from the Earth Coalition, Varela said, adjusting his cloak, which is exactly what you are. My consort. And you? Jace asked. Varela turned. She wore a gown of iridescent scales, shifting from violet to black. It was backless, daring, and utterly distracting. But hidden within the folds of the skirt were flash grenades, and strapped to her forearm, beneath a silk glove, was her bioblade. I am the prodigal daughter returning to beg forgiveness, she said. A disgraced princess coming to pledge fealty to the new order. They will love it. They love seeing royalty on its knees. And Kor? Varela glanced at the large stasis crate loaded onto the grav lift. He is the gift, she said darkly. She said, a rare specimen from the outer rim, presented to the Science Citadel for study. They will take him right where we need him to go, into the labs. She walked over to the crate. She placed her hand on the cold metal. Kor, she whispered. A low vibration answered her from inside. When the crate opens, Varela commanded, her voice echoing with the royal tone, do not hunt for food. Do not hunt for sport. Bring terror. The vibration deepened into a growl of assent. Aurora Prime was a jewel of light floating in the dark. The Science Citadel was a massive spire of glass and white stone, piercing the clouds beneath the Imperial Palace. The ballroom was a sea of gold. 3,000 dignitaries, warlords, and senators mingled under a ceiling that projected a live feed of the nebula. The music was soft, haunting, and completely at odds with the tension coiling in Jace's stomach. He walked with Varela on his arm. She moved through the crowd like a shark in a reef. She smiled. She bowed. She accepted the sneers and the whispered insults with a grace that terrified him. Look at her, a senator whispered as they passed. The traitor princess, crawling back for scraps. Varela's grip on Jace's arm tightened, just for a second. Steady, Jace murmured. I am fine, she replied through her teeth, smiling radiantly at the senator. I am just imagining how he will look when the citadel falls on his head. They reached the inner sanctum. a balcony overlooking the Senate chamber where the coronation would take place in an hour. Below them, the security was tight, but the delivery entrance to the labs, where the gift had just been taken, was unguarded from the inside. They had 10 minutes before the crate's timer released core. Varela pulled Jace into a shadowy alcove behind a statue of the first emperor. The noise of the party faded to a dull roar. "Here," she said, pressing a small data spike into his hand. "The main uplink is in the server room, 3 floors down. When the screaming starts, the security grid will crash. You upload the data, every file, every experiment, every stolen child, broadcast it to the entire galaxy." "And you?" Jace asked, pocketing the spike. "I am going to the throne room," she said. "Valis will be there. I need to keep him occupied. It is a suicide run. Varela." She looked at him. Her eyes were shining, not with tears, but with that fierce, unbearable light. "Maybe," she said. She reached up and touched his face, her thumb brushing the scar on his cheek. The masks were gone. The game was over. "Jace," she whispered. "Yeah?" "If I fall tonight," she said, her voice steady, "remember me as I am now. Not as the princess in the tower, not as the commander on the bridge." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "Remember me full of war," she said, "and full of you." She kissed him. It was soft, brief, and final. Then she pulled away, turned, and walked back into the light of the ballroom, her head held high, a queen marching to her execution. Jace watched her go. He checked the blaster under his coat. He checked the time, 2 minutes. He turned and headed for the service lift, deep beneath the ballroom, in the sterile white silence of the reception bay. A technician looked at the manifest on his datapad. "Thalzari biological specimen, class Alpha," he read, frowning. He looked at the massive crate. It was humming. "Hey, Unit 4. The technician called out to a droid. "Scan this. It is vibrating." The droid rolled forward. Its sensors swept the crate. "Warning." The droid chirped. "Heart rate detected. Adrenaline levels. Critical." The technician took a step back. "What?" "It is supposed to be sedated." "Negative," the droid replied. "Subject is fully awake. And what?" "The subject is anticipating door opening in 3, 2, 1. The lock on the crate did not click. It exploded. The metal door flew across the room, crushing the droid instantly. From the darkness of the box, a shadow emerged. It was huge, ancient, and terrifying. The technician froze, his mind unable to process the creature standing before him. Kor turned his head. The metal band over his eyes caught the harsh laboratory light. He sniffed the air, smelling the fear, smelling the antiseptic, smelling the children in the levels below. He opened his mouth and let out a roar that shook the foundations of the citadel, a sound of pure, prehistoric nightmare. The technician didn't even have time to scream before the terror began. The roar of the blind hunter was not merely a sound. It was a physical demolition of the peace that had reigned in the Imperial Science Citadel for a century. Kor, the ancient terror unleashed from the stasis crate, did not just kill, he dismantled. He moved through the sterile white corridors of the lower laboratories like a landslide of chitin and bone. Security doors were torn from their hinges. Automated defense turrets were crushed before they could cycle their targeting logic. The panic began in the basement, but it rose like black smoke, 30 floors above, in the server room. Jace Reiner watched the upload bar on the terminal. The progress was agonizingly slow. The Imperial firewalls were adapting, geometric algorithms shifting to block the intrusion. "Come on," Jace hissed, sweat dripping from his nose onto the holographic keyboard. "Do not freeze on me now." The door behind him shuddered. A plasma cutter was burning through the lock. The security teams had found him. Jace drew his blaster. He checked the charge. Full. He checked the upload. 90%. He turned and fired a single shot into the cooling unit of the massive server tower next to him. The liquid nitrogen tank ruptured, spraying a freezing fog into the room just as the door blew inward. Stormtroopers burst in, their white armor gleaming in the strobe lights. They fired blindly into the fog. Jace dove behind the main console. He didn't return fire. He reached up and slammed his hand onto the execute command. The screen flashed green. Transmission complete. Wideband galactic override initiated. Jace slumped against the metal, laughing breathlessly as laser fire chewed up the floor inches from his boot. It was done. The signal was out. In the grand ballroom. The music died. Princess Virella stood in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by the frozen elite of the galaxy. She had not drawn her weapon. She had simply waited, above them. The massive holographic ceiling, which had been displaying a serene nebula, flickered. The stars vanished. In their place, a gritty, high-contrast video feed appeared. It was the footage from the torture chamber in the graveyard station. It was the image of the children in the stasis tanks. It was the audio logs of Counselor Vallis authorizing the biological liquidation of human colonies. A gasp, collective and horrified, sucked the air out of the room. Virella looked up at the dais where High Counselor Vallis sat on the temporary throne. The old lizard was staring at the ceiling, his goblet falling from his hand to shatter on the marble. The video shifted. It showed the genetic compatibility charts. It showed the plan to replace the Senate with clone hybrids loyal only to the darker instincts of the Thalzari bloodline. Virella turned to the camera drones hovering nearby, the ones broadcasting the coronation to 1 trillion screens across the Empire. "Look at them!" Her voice rang out, amplified by the room's acoustics. "Not at me. Look at your leaders. They steal your children not to build a future, but to steal time for themselves. They are rotting in silk robes." Vallis stood up, his face turning a mottled gray. "Cut the feed. Kill her." But the royal guards did not move. They were looking at the screens. They were seeing the evidence of their own honor being sold for parts. Virella walked toward the dais. The crowd parted for her like water. "The Empire is a lie," she declared, her voice cold and absolute. And today, the lie ends. The chaos was instantaneous. It rippled out from Aurora Prime at the speed of light. On the mining colony of Agate 4, workers who saw the broadcast dropped their tools and picked up pry bars. They overwhelmed the garrison in an hour. On the border worlds, captains of the Imperial Navy looked at their orders, then at the footage of liquefied children, and mutinied. Ships turned their guns on their own command decks. In the Citadel ballroom, it was bedlam. Dignitaries were fleeing. Loyalists were drawing weapons on defectors. Virella did not stay to watch the political collapse. She had done her part. Now she had a promise to keep. She sprinted for the service elevator, her gown tearing as she moved. She met Jace in the corridor below. He was limping, his velvet coat scorched, but he was grinning. "Did you see it?" Jace yelled over the screaming of alarms. "The whole network lit up. The Outer Rim just declared independence." Virella grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the turbo shaft. "The revolution can wait." The signal came from the sub-basement, the primary lab. That is where they are keeping the last batch. They descended into the belly of the beast. The elevator shaft rattled as explosions rocked the upper levels. Core was somewhere below them, still hunting, still clearing the path. When the doors opened on the lowest level, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and copper. The bodies of elite guards littered the floor, torn apart by massive claws. Core had been here. They ran past the carnage, into the primary sanctum. It was a cathedral of science. Towering columns of glass stretched up into the darkness, filled with glowing amber fluid. Inside each column was a child, hundreds of them, suspended, dreaming, waiting to be harvested. Virella stopped. The sheer scale of it hit her like a physical blow. "No," she whispered. She ran to the nearest tank. A girl, tiny and frail, floated inside. Virella slammed her fist against the glass. It didn't break. It was reinforced bioglass, designed to withstand the vacuum of space. "Open them," she screamed, pounding the console. "Jace, open them!" Jace ran to the control terminal. He hacked at the keys, his hands flying. "It is locked out. Hard encryption. I cannot bypass it from here." Virella let out a sound of pure animal frustration. She grabbed a heavy metal stool from a workstation and swung it with all her strength. The glass cracked. A spiderweb fracture appeared. She swung again, and again. She was screaming, incoherent words of rage and grief. The glass shattered. Fluid gushed out, flooding the floor. The child fell out with it, limp and gasping. Virella dropped to her knees, checking the girl's pulse. Alive. She scrambled up, her hands bleeding from the shards, and ran to the next tank. She didn't wait for the stool. She smashed the glass with her bare fists, the biosteel of her gauntlets cracking the surface. "Virella!" Jace shouted, running to her. "Stop! You're going to kill yourself. I have to get them out." She sobbed, striking the glass until her knuckles split. "They are drowning." Jace grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms. She fought him, thrashing, her eyes wild and unseeing. "Virella!" "Look at me," Jace roared, turning her around. "Look at me. We will get them out, but you need to breathe." She collapsed against him, shaking violently. The adrenaline crash was hitting her, mixing with the horror of the room. Suddenly, a slow clapping echoed from the shadows at the far end of the lab. "Very touching," a voice said, smooth, melodic, terrifyingly familiar. Virella froze. She pushed Jace away and turned. Stepping out of the gloom was a figure. He was tall, unclothed save for a modest drape of white silk. His skin was flawless, glowing with a faint internal luminescence. His muscles were sculpted to perfection. It was Admiral Cassior, but not the Cassior she had killed. This one was younger, stronger. His eyes were not the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a god who had never known fear. The clone. "Cousin." The clone smiled, spreading his arms. "You are looking old. Stress does terrible things to the complexion." "You are dead," Virella hissed, her bioblade snapping out from her wrist. "I cut your throat." "That was the prototype," the clone said, dismissing the memory with a wave of his hand. "A rough draft. I am the final edit, the culmination of the harvest." He took a step forward, and the floor tiles cracked under his bare foot. "I am the future you were too weak to build, Virella. I am Thalzari perfection, immortal, flawless." He looked at Jace. "And you are just biology waiting to be corrected." Jace raised his blaster and fired. 3 shots, center mass. The bolts hit the clone's chest. The skin absorbed the energy, rippling like water. There were no burns, no wounds. The clone sighed, rude. He moved. He was a blur of motion, faster than the eye could track. He crossed the 30 meters between them in a heartbeat. He backhanded Jace. The force of the blow sent Jace flying across the lab. He smashed into a control console, metal buckling under his spine. He hit the floor and didn't move. "Jace!" Virella screamed. She lunged at the clone, her blade aimed at his heart. He caught her wrist. He didn't even look at it. He stopped her strike with the casual ease of an adult stopping a toddler. He squeezed. Virella cried out as the bones in her forearm ground together. Pathetic, the clone sneered, looking into her eyes. You have the blood of kings, yet you fight like a brawler. He threw her. She skidded across the wet floor, crashing into the base of a shattered tank. Glass shards sliced into her back. She tried to stand, but the clone was already there. He kicked her in the ribs, flipping her over. He placed a foot on her throat, pressing down with crushing weight. Do you feel it? Virella? He asked softly. Obsolescence? You are a relic. I am going to crush the life out of you, and then I am going to drain that human of his essence to toast my ascension. Virella gasped for air, clawing at his ankle. Her vision was swimming. She looked past him, toward the workstation where Jace lay. Jace was moving. Slowly. Painfully. He was reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver canister. The data spike he had used earlier was gone. But this was the canister she had synthesized in the graveyard station's med bay. The failsafe. The original unstable genetic sequence that had killed her sister. He rolled it across the floor. It skidded through the fluid, clinking against the tiles. It stopped inches from Virella's hand. The clone didn't see it. He was too busy gloating, watching the light fade from Virella's eyes. Say goodbye, cousin, the clone whispered. Virella's hand closed around the cold metal of the canister. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. She jammed the canister into the clone's ankle, driving the injector needle deep into the Achilles tendon. The clone flinched, stepping back in surprise. What is this? Virella rolled away, gasping, clutching her throat. History, she rasped. The clone looked down at his leg. The injection site was turning black. A dark necrotic web was spreading up his calf, moving with terrifying speed. He laughed. Poison? You think you can poison a god? My metabolism will neutralize this in seconds. He took a step toward her, but his leg gave way. The bone snapped with a wet crunch. He fell to one knee, shock replacing the arrogance on his face. What? What have you done? Virella stood up, swaying. She picked up her bioblade from where it had fallen. I gave you what you wanted, she said, her voice gaining strength. You wanted the original bloodline? You wanted the purity of the ancestors? The black rot reached the clone's waist. His skin began to ripple, boiling as his cellular structure collapsed. The immortality serum was fighting the instability virus, creating a catastrophic biological war inside his body. I gave you the flaw, Virella whispered. The mortality you tried to breed out. The clone screamed. It was a sound that wasn't human. His perfect face began to melt, the features sliding off the skull, his muscles liquefied. The glow faded into a sickly, dying gray. No, he shrieked, clawing at his own melting flesh. I am eternal. I am. He collapsed into a puddle of genetic sludge, thrashing for one final agonizing moment before the silence took him. Virella stood over the remains, her chest heaving. She didn't look away. She watched until the bubbling stopped. Then she turned and ran to Jace. He was alive, battered, broken ribs, a concussion that made his eyes unfocused, but alive. Hey! Jace coughed, blood coating his teeth. Did we win? Virella pulled him into a sitting position, wiping the hair from his forehead. Her hands were shaking, but her touch was gentle. We won, she said, tears finally spilling over. Around them, the tanks were opening. The emergency release protocols triggered by the death of the clone, the system's biological key, were engaging. One by one, the children woke up. They fell from the amber prisons, coughing, crying, confused. Virella stood up. She looked at the sea of small, frightened faces. She didn't see soldiers. She didn't see genetic material. She saw the future. "Come on," she said softly, her voice carrying through the lab. "It is okay. You are safe now." She held out her arms. The first child, the girl she had pulled from the tank, ran to her. Then another, then a dozen. They surrounded her, clinging to her legs, her torn dress, her bloodied hands. Jace watched from the floor, a smile breaking through the pain on his face. He watched the warrior become the mother, the destroyer become the shelter. Above them, through the shattered ceiling of the upper levels, the first light of dawn, a real natural dawn, broke over the burning city. The children looked up at the light, and then they ran toward it. The collapse of the Thalzari Empire was not a singular event. It was a cascade. Following the broadcast and the destruction of the Science Citadel, the central government dissolved in a week. High Counselor Vallis was arrested by his own house guard. The Senate was suspended. 3 weeks later, in the ruins of the Imperial Palace, a provisional council gathered. They were rebels, defectors, and old loyalists who had seen the error of their ways. Virella stood before them. She wore simple clothes, a gray tunic and trousers. No armor, no crown. "We need a leader," High General Kale, one of the defectors, said, bowing low. "The people know your name, Princess. They know you broke the chains. Take the throne. Restore the honor of your house." Virella looked at the throne. It was a massive chair of obsidian and gold, imposing and cold. She touched the armrest. She thought of Kazior. She thought of the clone. She thought of the centuries of blood that had been spilled to keep this seat warm. She turned her back on it. "No," she said. The council murmured in confusion. "Princess?" Kyle asked. "If not you, then who?" "Anyone else," Virella said. "Let them choose a better ruler, a teacher, a healer. Someone who knows how to build, not just how to destroy." She walked toward the great doors, where Jace was waiting for her. He was leaning on a cane, healing but upright. "I have seen enough war," Virella said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "I am done with empires." She walked out into the sunlight, taking Jace's hand. They descended the stairs of the palace, leaving the power and the politics behind them. "What now?" Jace asked as they reached the landing pad where Ovara's ship waited. Virella looked up at the sky. It was blue, vast, and open. "We found a quiet place," she said. Jace raised an eyebrow. "Quiet? You? You will be bored in a week." Virella smiled. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. It was a small gesture, unnoticed by the guards watching them leave, but earth-shattering for the two of them. "I doubt it," she said softly. "I have a lot of work to do. I have to raise the children I saved." She looked into his eyes, the violet softening to a warm lilac. "Or the one we made." Jace stopped. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. He looked at her stomach, then at her face. "You." "We," Virella laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Let us go home." Jace. Epilogue. The moon was not on any star chart. It was a small green world in the uncontrolled territories of the Veil Nebula. The gravity was light, the air smelled of pine and rain, and the only structures were the ones they had built with their own hands. A large timber house stood on a hill overlooking a valley. In the valley, a dozen children of various ages and species were playing a game that involved a ball and a lot of shouting. Ilara, now a teenager, was leading them, her laughter carrying on the wind, on the porch. Virella sat in a rocking chair. She was watching them. She looked peaceful, her features softened by the years. But her eyes were still sharp. She was peeling an apple with a small paring knife, the only blade she carried these days. A shadow fell over her. Jace walked up the steps. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag. He had filled out the gaunt despair of the prison camps, replaced by the healthy muscle of a man who worked the land. "Windmill is fixed," he said, leaning down to kiss her neck. The fusion coil was misaligned. Should give us power for another 50 years. Varela leaned back into him, closing her eyes. "Good. We will need it for the winter heating." Jace watched the children playing. Ilara had just scored a goal, and the younger ones were tackling her in celebration. "They are happy," Jace said quietly. "They are free," Varela corrected. She opened her eyes and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. They were beautiful, twinkling diamonds in the velvet dark. But Varela knew what hid in the dark. She knew the monsters, the tyrants, the scientists who saw life as a resource. She rested her hand on her stomach, which was round and full with life. Jace wrapped his arms around her shoulders, following her gaze. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The fight?" Varela shook her head. "No." She watched a shooting star streak across the horizon. Her hand tightened on the paring knife, just for a second. "But I haven't forgotten how to do it," she whispered. She turned her head, brushing her lips against Jace's jaw. "Next time, if they take a child." Her eyes flashed with that old, dangerous violet fire, the fire of a princess who had burned an empire to the ground to save the innocent. "I will send the stars to burn them." Jace smiled, holding her tight as the night settled over their quiet, hard-won paradise. "I know you will, princess. I know you will."